What you're about to hear isn't a story for the faint-hearted. This case is not about ghosts or monsters. It's about something far more disturbing. The darkness that can live inside a perfectly ordinary human being. If you ever believed that evil could only exist in fiction, this story will challenge that belief. This is the story of Armin Meiwes, the man the world would later call the Cannibal of Rottenburg. It began with an online advertisement, a message posted deep within the early corners of the internet, written in plain words that froze the spine of anyone who came across it. It read, "I am looking for a young man between 18 and 30, healthy with a normal body, someone willing to give himself to me completely and body and soul." At first, it sounded like a strange fantasy, a dark corner of role play or shock humor, but this wasn't fantasy. The author of that post meant every word. He wasn't searching for friendship. He was searching for someone who was willing to be killed and eaten. That message came from a man named Armin Meiwes, a computer technician from the small German town of Rottenburg. And as twisted as that ad sounded, what shocked investigators even more was that someone actually answered it. Someone who was willing. To understand how such a nightmare could begin, we have to go back to Armin's childhood. He was born in 1961. In a quiet town called Essen. His family wasn't poor, nor was it violent, but it was broken. His father was a police officer who paid little attention to the family, while his mother, Waltraud, was controlling, strict, and unpredictable. She had already been through 2 marriages before Armin's father, and she brought her frustration and paranoia into every part of their home. When Armin was just 8 years old, his father suddenly walked out. No note, no goodbye. The abandonment scarred him deeply. His mother's anger and possessiveness only grew stronger. She hovered over every part of his life, controlling where he went, who he met, even what he thought. By the time his half-brothers also left home, Armin and his mother were all that was left inside their enormous estate, a mansion with 44 rooms, sitting isolated at the edge of Rottenburg. Imagine that, a boy and his mother, alone in a house large enough to hold a school, surrounded by silence outside. The town was nearly empty, barely 30 residents. Inside, there was only control, shouting, and loneliness. Armin grew up feeling trapped inside walls and inside his own mind. He wasn't allowed friends. His mother accompanied him everywhere, to doctor's visits, school events, even on what should have been dates. His world shrank to the size of that mansion, and inside it, his imagination began to fill the empty space. He started talking to himself, and at first quietly, then constantly. He invented a friend, an invisible companion named Frankie who, in his imagination, stayed by his side through everything. Frankie listened when no one else did. Frankie never left. But loneliness does strange things to the human mind. Over time, Armin began to fear even Frankie would abandon him. And then came a thought that would define the rest of his life. If he could consume someone he loved, take them into himself, then they could never leave. They would live inside him forever. That single haunting idea became an obsession. He wrote about it in his diary. He imagined it in drawings. And when he looked at the pigs hanging from hooks in the local slaughterhouse, he began to picture people instead. To the outside world, Armin seemed perfectly normal at 20. He joined the German army and served for over a decade. He was disciplined, intelligent, well-spoken. No one suspected the world he carried inside his mind. He even got engaged once, but broke it off because his fiancée resembled his mother, a woman he both feared and resented. When his mother finally died in 1999, Armin was left completely alone in that massive, silent house. For the first time in his life, there was no one to control him, and no one to keep him grounded. He spent nights scrolling through online forums, places where people shared strange fantasies and extreme desires, and that's where he discovered the Cannibal Cafe, an underground message board for people fascinated by the idea of human consumption. Most users were only pretending, writing stories, role-playing, chasing taboo, but not Armin. For him, these fantasies were blueprints. In 2000, he wrote that now infamous ad, searching not for prey but for a volunteer. To his astonishment, people responded. Men from across Europe messaged him. Curious, nervous, some even eager, they discussed the unthinkable. But each one backed out before meeting in person until one man didn't. In early 2001, Armin received a message from a user calling himself Cater99. His real name was Bernd Jürgen Brandes, a 43-year-old engineer from Berlin on the surface. Brandes was successful, good job, nice apartment, polite manners, but privately, he was struggling with deep loneliness and a complicated relationship with his own identity. His mother had died when he was young, and he had grown up craving connection yet fearing rejection. He was drawn to danger, to the idea of surrender, control, and ultimate escape. When he read Armin's post, it didn't horrify him. It fascinated him. He saw it as a way to give up control completely, to let someone else decide when and how his story would end. The two men talked for months. Online at first, then by phone. They shared every secret, every fear, every fantasy to Armin. Brandes seemed like a dream, someone who understood him, who didn't laugh, who didn't leave. To Brandes, Armin was peace, someone who promised to take away the pain of existence. After weeks of messages, they agreed to meet in person. It was March 9th, 2001. Brandes arrived by train, carrying a bag, a bottle of wine, and a strange sense of calm. He wasn't running from Armin. He was walking toward him, toward the fate he had chosen. Armin met him at the station. They drove to the enormous mansion on the edge of Rottenburg, in the same 44-room house that had once echoed with his mother's voice and now stood silent there. The two men shared dinner, wine, and conversation. They talked about life, loneliness, and the act they both saw as a strange form of connection. Armin wanted to believe it was love. Brandes wanted to believe it was freedom. At this point, what happened next was recorded. Not because Armin wanted proof of violence, but because he wanted to preserve the memory of what he called a mutual decision. That tape would later horrify investigators. In the early hours of the morning, Brandes' life ended, and Armin fulfilled the fantasy he had nurtured since childhood. He believed that by consuming a part of Brandes, he was keeping him alive inside himself forever. He cleaned the scene carefully, placed what remained in cold storage, and carried on with his daily life as though nothing had happened. For months, no one knew Brandes was reported missing, but he had left no signs of foul play and only emails, cryptic and resigned, saying he was leaving forever. Armin, meanwhile, continued his routine. He went to work, shopped for groceries, chatted politely with neighbors. No one could have imagined that inside his home sat evidence of one of the most disturbing crimes in modern history. Nearly a year later, Armin returned to the same online forums, posting messages about what he had done, not to brag, but to find someone else. He said he was looking for another volunteer. That post caught the attention of another forum user, who became suspicious and contacted the police. On December 10th, 2002, officers arrived at the Meiwes estate. As soon as they stepped inside, they sensed something was wrong. The air was cold, heavy, and carried a faint metallic scent. They followed it to a freezer, stacked neatly with labeled packages, wrapped in plastic and covered with pizza boxes. When asked what was inside, Armin calmly said, "Just meat." The officers didn't believe him. Forensic tests later confirmed the unimaginable truth. The meat was human, and the man it belonged to was Bernd-Jürgen Brandes. Investigators searched the rest of the house and discovered the recording. When they played it, what they saw wasn't rage or chaos. It was quiet, chillingly calm. A man documenting what he believed was a consensual act of connection. Detectives described it as one of the most haunting things they had ever seen. When the case reached the public, Germany was in shock. How could an act so horrific be done so rationally? How could two adults agree to something so extreme? Philosophers, psychologists, and lawyers debated whether this was murder, assisted suicide, or something else entirely. In 2004, Armin Meiwes was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 8 years in prison. But the outrage didn't stop there. On appeal, prosecutors argued that consent didn't matter, that taking a life, even willingly, could never be justified. The case was retried this time. Armin was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. During his time behind bars, Armin remained calm and polite. He gave interviews to journalists, expressing remorse but also insisting that he had never wanted to harm anyone unwillingly. He said he had been searching for love, for someone who would never leave him. He claimed that in his own twisted way he had found it. Even today, the house in Rottenburg still stands, the 44-room mansion where loneliness grew into obsession. People from around the world visit the area, curious to see the place where the unimaginable happened. And online, despite constant bans, new forums continue to appear, echoing the same dark fantasies that first connected Armin Meiwes and Bernd Brandes. This case forced the world to ask terrifying questions. Where does fantasy and crime begin? Can consent erase guilt? And how far can loneliness drive a human mind before it breaks? What makes the story of Armin Meiwes so disturbing isn't just what he did. It's why he did it. He didn't act out of hatred or rage. He acted out of isolation, a desperate need to never be alone again. He once said, "I wanted someone to stay with me forever," and now he does. Those words reveal the darkest truth of all. Sometimes the most dangerous monsters are not the ones who hate the world, but the ones who cannot bear to be left by it. That is the story of the Rottenburg Cannibal, the man who tried to fill the emptiness inside him by consuming another soul. A story that began with loneliness, ended in horror, and left behind a question that will haunt humanity forever. How far can love and isolation twist the human mind before it becomes something unrecognizable?